I bought a house for myself, not for my sis who sided with my cheating ex. Nathan had built a stable, comfortable life for himself. At 34, he had a decent job, a modestly rented house, and a wife, Lauren, whom he had loved since their college days. Their relationship had not always been perfect, but it was solid, or at least, he thought it was. That illusion shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces on their anniversary. The day had started like any other, with Nathan making plans to surprise Lauren. He had left work early, picked up flowers, and even stopped by their favorite restaurant to get takeout, just as they had done on their very first anniversary. His heart was light as he stepped through the front door, eager to see her reaction. But instead of Lauren's warm smile or an anniversary embrace, he was met with an entirely different sight. The bedroom door was slightly ajar. Soft noises filtered through the air, whispers, laughter, the unmistakable sound of a bed creaking under shifting weight. Nathan's pulse pounded in his ears as he took cautious steps forward, dread curling in his stomach like a slow-moving poison. He told himself that it had to be a misunderstanding. Maybe Lauren was watching a movie, or maybe she had a friend over. But then he heard her voice. And another voice. A man's voice. His heart plummeted as he pushed the door open. There, tangled in their bed, his bed, was Lauren. And not just with anyone. With their neighbor. The man who lived just 2 doors down. The man who had borrowed his tools, who had shared beers with him over backyard fences, who had smiled in his face as if they were friends. Lauren screamed. The neighbor scrambled, clutching for sheets, stammering something incoherent. But Nathan barely heard them. His vision blurred at the edges, his breath turned shallow. His chest felt tight, constricted, like the air had been sucked from the room. A deep, shuddering silence fell between them as the reality of the moment sank in. Lauren didn't beg for forgiveness. She didn't even try to explain. Instead, she pulled the sheet around herself and stared at him, guilt flickering across her features but never settling. It was as if she had been caught stealing a cookie, not committing the ultimate betrayal. Nathan turned and left. The pain didn't hit all at once. It came in waves. It crashed into him on the drive away from their house, as he gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. It crushed him when he parked in an empty lot, staring blankly at the dashboard, trying to process how everything he thought was real had been a lie. But the worst part? The part that made it unbearable? His sister, Rachel, sided with Lauren. Rachel, his own flesh and blood, the person he had protected growing up, the one he had always supported, chose Lauren. Not because she believed Lauren was innocent, but because Lauren was useful. Lauren bought expensive gifts for Rachel's kids. Lauren babysat whenever Rachel asked. And apparently, that was worth more than loyalty. She made a mistake, Nate, Rachel had said, voice dripping with forced sympathy. But let's be honest, this doesn't have to be the end of your marriage. People work through things like this all the time. It was a knife in the back. His sister wasn't just excusing Lauren's actions, she was justifying them. She was telling him that what he walked in on, what had shattered his entire world, was just something to work through. Nathan couldn't believe what he was hearing. His own sister had betrayed him for the sake of convenience. Then came his parents. They too didn't offer the support he so desperately needed. Instead, his mother placed a gentle hand on his shoulder and said, "Marriage is about compromise, Nathan. You need to work this out." Work it out? How do you work out infidelity? How do you compromise with someone who desecrated the most sacred thing between 2 people? His father, usually a man of few words, only nodded in agreement. "You've been together for a long time, son. Maybe you shouldn't throw that away so quickly." Throw it away? Nathan felt sick. It was as if the world had turned on him. The people he had expected to stand by him, to rally around him in his lowest moment, were instead telling him to swallow his pride, to move past it, to forgive something unforgivable. His entire life had collapsed, and no one seemed to care. He was alone. The divorce was brutal, drawn out like a slow, agonizing death. Lauren fought for everything, every piece of furniture, every asset, and even things that had nothing to do with her. She tried to take the car Nathan had bought years before they even met, claiming that since they had been married, it was now part of their shared assets. She demanded alimony, despite earning more than him at her new job, one that, ironically, she had landed thanks to networking with the very neighbor she had cheated with. Nathan tried to fight back, but the legal system wasn't kind to men like him, men who didn't have endless funds to burn on lawyers, men who were left bleeding in the aftermath of betrayal. Lauren played the game well, painting herself as the wronged party. She spun a narrative where she was the victim, where their marriage had been unfulfilling and stifling, as if her affair was some noble act of self-discovery rather than raw, callous selfishness. And Rachel? His own sister? She was right there by Lauren's side, holding her hand through court hearings, nodding sympathetically as Lauren cried crocodile tears on the stand, as if she had been the one wronged. Rachel testified that Lauren had been unhappy for years, and that Nathan had always been too focused on himself to notice. Nathan wanted to scream. Too focused on himself? He had worked his ass off for them, for Lauren, for their future. He had sacrificed, saved, planned. And what did he get in return? A knife in the back, driven in deep by the two people he had trusted most. By the time the dust settled, Nathan was left with nothing but a tiny, depressing apartment, a place so small it felt like a shoebox. The walls were thin, the paint chipped, the floors creaked under every step. The mattress he slept on wasn't even a real bed, it was a cheap second-hand one he had dragged in off Facebook Marketplace. He lived off dollar store coffee and instant ramen, his savings drained by legal fees. And the worst part? Lauren and Rachel flaunted their victory at every turn. They flooded social media with their lavish outings, shopping sprees at designer boutiques, extravagant dinners at places Nathan had never even stepped foot in, tropical vacations where they posed in sunglasses and clinked glasses filled with drinks that cost more than his weekly groceries. Every time he logged in, there it was, Lauren smiling as if she had won the lottery, Rachel beaming at her side, their captions dripping with barely concealed mockery. Best decision I ever made. Freedom looks good on us. Surround yourself with people who lift you up. It was humiliating. Every like, every comment, every emoji reaction felt like a jab, a reminder that Nathan was nothing to them now, just some discarded piece of their past, an afterthought to be ridiculed. He tried to ignore it. He tried to move on, to focus on surviving. But then came the moment that shattered what little dignity he had left. It was a random, miserable Tuesday when he ran into Rachel at the grocery store. He hadn't seen her in person since the divorce, and for a brief, foolish second, he thought maybe she would be civil. Maybe there was still some part of her that remembered they were family. But Rachel took one look at him, standing there in his worn-out hoodie, clutching a basket filled with discount frozen meals, and she smirked. "Wow," she said, dragging out the word as she eyed him up and down. "This is sad. I mean, I knew you were struggling, but I didn't think it was this bad." Nathan clenched his jaw, saying nothing. She tossed her perfectly styled hair over her shoulder, her nails, manicured and undoubtedly paid for by Lauren, tapping against the handle of her designer purse. "You know, you really should take some advice from Lauren." She figured out how to land on her feet. "Maybe you should try finding yourself a rich friend too." Nathan gripped the basket so tightly his knuckles turned white. Rachel laughed, as if this was all some joke to her. "Oh, come on, don't look at me like that. It's not my fault you decided to be all principled about everything. You could have played it smarter, you know." It took everything in him not to explode, not to cause a scene right then and there in the middle of the grocery store. Instead, he turned on his heel and walked away, his heart pounding in his chest. That night, he sat in his tiny apartment, staring at the cracked ceiling, Rachel's words echoing in his mind. "Maybe you should try finding yourself a rich friend too. You could have played it smarter." He had never wanted to be the kind of person who played dirty. He had always believed in working hard, in doing things the right way. But what had that gotten him? Betrayal. Humiliation. As he sat there, his stomach empty, his pride in tatters, a realization hit him like a freight train. This wasn't rock bottom. Rock bottom wasn't some tiny apartment or eating instant ramen. Rock bottom was letting them win. And Nathan refused to let them win. He wasn't going to wallow. He wasn't going to let them laugh at his expense forever. If they wanted to believe he was a failure, fine. Let them. Because when he came back, when he rebuilt his life from the ground up, he was going to make sure they regretted every single moment they had ever looked down on him. That night, for the first time in months, Nathan didn't feel hopeless. He felt something else entirely. Determined. Nathan threw himself into work like a man possessed. He took every shift he could get at the garage, working 12, sometimes 14-hour days. When his coworkers clocked out and went home, Nathan stayed behind, taking on extra side jobs fixing up cars for cash. His hands were constantly covered in grease, his back ached from leaning under hoods for hours, and he was perpetually exhausted, but he didn't care. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about reclaiming his dignity. Every time his body begged him to slow down, he thought of Lauren and Rachel, sipping expensive cocktails at rooftop bars, laughing at his misfortune. He thought about that smirk on Rachel's face at the grocery store, about Lauren parading around as if she hadn't torn his life apart. And instead of resting, he pushed harder. His boss, George, a gruff but fair man in his 60s, noticed. George had been running the garage for over 30 years and had seen plenty of mechanics come and go. But there was something different about Nathan now, something relentless. He showed up early, stayed late, and worked with the kind of hunger George had only seen in men with something to prove. "You look like hell," George grumbled one night, watching Nathan scrub the grease off his arms after another long shift. "What's driving you?" Nathan wiped his hands on an already filthy rag. "I need more," he said simply. George studied him for a moment, then nodded. He didn't press for details, but from that night on, he started giving Nathan more responsibility. It started small, letting him handle more expensive repairs, trusting him with customer interactions. Then it grew. He let Nathan handle ordering parts, managing invoices, even overseeing the newer guys in the shop. Nathan took it all in stride. At the same time, he signed up for online business classes, using every spare minute to study. His evenings were spent hunched over his cheap laptop, watching lectures on profit margins and inventory management. He took notes until his eyes burned from staring at the screen. He wasn't just going to fix cars forever. He was going to own something. The first real shift happened one evening when George handed him a thick envelope. "That's your cut from the last few big jobs you handled," George said. "You've been pulling more than your weight around here." Nathan opened it and felt his throat tighten. It was more money than he had seen in months. "Why are you giving me this?" Nathan asked cautiously. George sighed and leaned against the workbench. "Because I see something in you, kid. You remind me of myself when I was younger, hungry, pissed off, out to prove something. And I like that." He folded his arms. "I've been thinking about selling this place in a couple of years. My wife wants me to retire, and my kids sure as hell don't want it. Figured maybe you'd want first dibs." Nathan froze. "You're serious?" George nodded. "Yeah. You'd have to save up, and I won't be giving it away for free, but you're the only guy I trust to run this place right." Nathan clenched his jaw, fighting back the surge of emotion. For the first time in a long, long time, he felt like he was taking control of his life again. But control didn't mean the world suddenly got easier. He still lived in that tiny apartment with peeling paint and a fridge that rattled like it was about to die. He still had to ignore Rachel's posts about her luxury weekends with Lauren. He still ran into people from his old life who gave him pitying glances, as if he were some tragic figure. One day, while grabbing a coffee at a gas station before work, he overheard two former friends talking about him near the checkout. "Man, did you see Rachel's story the other day?" One of them, Mark, said with a laugh. "Lauren got her a damn designer bag. Probably worth more than Nathan's whole apartment." The other guy snorted. "Dude, I can't believe he's still working at that garage. I thought for sure he'd have crawled back to Lauren by now. Guess he's too proud." Nathan tightened his grip on his cup. They had no idea how much he had changed. Instead of confronting them, he walked out, got in his car, and drove straight to the garage. If they thought he was pathetic, fine. Let them. They wouldn't be laughing when he came back stronger. And one day, when he finally owned that garage, when he had built something out of nothing, he would make damn sure they all saw what he had become. The moment Rachel found out about the house, everything changed. For years, she had treated Nathan like he was nothing, mocking his struggles, siding with Lauren, flaunting her wealth while he scraped by. She had watched him suffer, laughed at his downfall, and never once reached out when he was at his lowest. But now that he was successful, now that he had rebuilt himself from nothing, suddenly she was interested in being family again. It started with casual texts. "Hey Nate. Haven't talked in a while. How's life?" He ignored them. Then came the fake concern. "I was thinking about you the other day. We should catch up. Family is important, you know." He ignored that too. But Rachel didn't stop. She started asking about his work, making vague comments about how proud she was of him. And then, finally, she got to the point. "I heard about the house. Wow, big step. Maybe we should celebrate." Nathan scoffed when he read it. Of course. The house. The garage had become his, just as George had promised. It had taken years of grueling hours, relentless dedication, and scraping together every cent he had, but it was his now. He had gone from being a broken man in a tiny apartment to someone who owned a business, a respected business. And with that success came stability, the kind of stability Rachel suddenly found very interesting. Days after her last message, Rachel showed up at his door. With bags. With her kids. Nathan stood there, staring at her in disbelief as she smiled like nothing had ever happened. "Surprise!" she chirped, dragging a suitcase over the threshold. The kids and I are gonna stay with you for a while. Just until we get things figured out. Nathan didn't move. His grip tightened on the doorframe. You're kidding. Rachel blinked innocently. What? No. It'll be great, just like old times. The kids need some stability, and you've got all this space now. I mean, why not? You've got a big house, plenty of room. No. The word came out flat, firm. Rachel's smile faltered. What do you mean, no? I mean no, Nathan said. You're not moving in here. Not now, not ever. Rachel's face twisted in frustration, but she forced out a laugh, trying to keep the act going. Oh, come on, Nate. We're family. Family helps each other out. Nathan's jaw clenched. Funny. You didn't seem too concerned about family when you were posting pictures with Lauren while I was living in a shoebox. Or when you laughed in my face at the grocery store. Now that I'm doing well, suddenly I'm family again? Rachel's expression darkened. That's not fair. Nathan let out a sharp, humorless laugh. Fair? You want to talk about fair? Where was fairness when you and Lauren humiliated me? When you backed her up in court? When you treated me like a joke? No, Rachel. You don't get to show up now and pretend we're close. Rachel's kids stood awkwardly behind her, sensing the tension but not fully understanding it. Rachel tried a different angle, her voice softening. Look, I know we haven't always seen eye to eye, but things are different now. I'm struggling, Nate. I just need a little help. Nathan shook his head. That's not my problem. The act dropped instantly. Rachel's face twisted in anger. You're seriously going to do this? To me? To your own niece and nephew? Nathan didn't flinch. You're not using them to manipulate me. You made your choice, Rachel. You picked Lauren over me. You laughed when I had nothing. You don't get to act like family when it's convenient for you. Rachel's hands balled into fists. You're so selfish. Mom and Dad were right about you. Nathan felt the sting of those words, but he didn't let it show. He simply folded his arms. Then go ask them for help. And with that, he stepped back and shut the door. Rachel pounded on it, shouting his name, but he didn't open it again. That night, the phone calls started. First from Rachel, then from their parents. His mother's voice was dripping with disappointment. Nathan, how could you turn your back on your sister? She needs you. His father was more direct. You think you're better than us now? Just because you own some business. Nathan sat in silence, listening to them take turns berating him. He waited until they were done. Then he said, Where were you when I needed you? Silence. You told me to work it out when Lauren cheated on me. You let Rachel mock me while I was at my lowest. You only care now because I have something you want. I'm not your backup plan. I'm done. His mother gasped. Nathan. But he had already hung up. For the first time in his life, he felt free. Nathan woke up to silence. No more late-night calls from his parents trying to guilt him into helping Rachel. No more texts from Rachel pretending to be the sister she had abandoned years ago. No more ghosts from his past trying to crawl back into his life now that he had something they wanted. For the first time in years, his life was his. He got ready for work, brewed himself a cup of coffee in his own kitchen, and stepped outside onto the porch of the house that he had earned. The sun was just rising, casting a golden light over the property, and for a moment, Nathan just stood there, breathing it all in. No one had handed this to him. No one had believed in him. He had clawed his way back from rock bottom with his own 2 hands, and now, he was exactly where he was meant to be. He drove to the garage, walking in to the familiar scent of oil and metal. The guys greeted him like usual, nods, grunts, and half-hearted insults that were just their way of showing respect. His name was on the building now, but he didn't act like a boss who sat behind a desk all day. He still got his hands dirty. He still worked alongside them, still took the hardest jobs, still made sure that when someone brought their car into his shop, they left knowing they had been taken care of by the best. George had officially retired a few months back, but he still dropped by every once in a while, sipping coffee and watching Nathan run the place with that same knowing smirk. "Didn't think you'd actually pull it off, kid," he admitted one day, leaning against a toolbox. Nathan had just wiped his hands clean from another job. "Yeah? And why's that?" "Because most guys in your position would've let it break them." George took a slow sip. "Most guys would've rolled over, blamed the world, and stayed bitter for the rest of their lives." Nathan just shrugged. "Didn't have time for that." George chuckled. "Damn right you didn't." Nathan had spent so much time building that he never really stopped to think about what came next. Now that the garage was his, now that he had his house, now that his past was finally where it belonged, what was left? One evening, he sat on his porch, looking out over his property, and for the first time in years, he let himself relax. No more anger. No more resentment. No more looking over his shoulder, waiting for another knife in the back. The people who had betrayed him were gone. Rachel was struggling, still trying to get by after years of living off of other people. Their parents had given up on him, realizing they couldn't manipulate him anymore. And Lauren? She had disappeared completely. He didn't know where she had gone, and frankly, he didn't care. All he cared about was the fact that he had rebuilt his life in a way they never thought he could. He had proven them all wrong. Not with revenge. Not with hatred. But by moving on. And that, more than anything, was the greatest victory of all. Nathan had spent years fighting, clawing his way out of the wreckage of his past. He had faced betrayal, humiliation, and abandonment from the very people who were supposed to stand by him. And yet, here he was, standing tall, stronger than ever, and completely free of them. For the first time in his life, he wasn't chasing anything. He wasn't looking over his shoulder, waiting for the next blow to come. He wasn't trying to prove anything to anyone. He had already won. The garage was thriving, more successful than it had ever been under George's ownership. Nathan had expanded, hiring more guys, offering more services, and turning the once small shop into a name that people in town actually trusted. His house, had gone from a simple structure to something he had poured his sweat and effort into. He had renovated the floors, redone the kitchen, and built a space that finally felt like home. There was no sign of Lauren. No sign of Rachel. No sign of his parents. And he preferred it that way. Then, one afternoon, as he was closing up at the garage, a familiar face appeared in the doorway. "George. You got a minute, kid?" Nathan wiped the grease from his hands and leaned against the counter. "Always." George took a seat, looking around the garage with a small nod of approval. "You really did it," he mused. "Better than I ever could have." Nathan smiled. "You gave me the shot. That's all I needed." George scoffed. "I gave plenty of guys shots. You're the only one who didn't waste it." There was a pause, the kind that only happened between two men who had mutual respect but didn't feel the need to say it outright. George finally broke the silence. "So, what's next for you?" Nathan exhaled, staring out at the lot filled with cars. "Honestly," he looked back at George, "I don't know." And for once, that didn't scare him. For so long, his life had been about survival, about proving people wrong, about reclaiming his dignity. Now, he was just living, and that was enough. As George stood to leave, he clapped a hand on Nathan's shoulder. "Whatever it is, you'll figure it out." Nathan smiled, watching as his old mentor walked out the door. He locked up the garage, drove home, and sat on his porch as the sun dipped below the horizon. There was no more anger, no more resentment, no more ghosts from his past trying to drag him back down. He had built a life without them. And in the end, that was the best revenge of all. Nathan had spent years fighting, clawing his way out of the wreckage of his past. He had faced betrayal, humiliation, and abandonment from the very people who were supposed to stand by him. And yet, here he was, standing tall, stronger than ever, and completely free of them. For the first time in his life, he wasn't chasing anything. He wasn't looking over his shoulder, waiting for the next blow to come. He wasn't trying to prove anything to anyone. He had already won. The garage was thriving, more successful than it had ever been under George's ownership. Nathan had expanded, hiring more guys, offering more services, and turning the once small shop into a name that people in town actually trusted. His house, had gone from a simple structure to something he had poured his sweat and effort into. He had renovated the floors, redone the kitchen, and built a space that finally felt like home. There was no sign of Lauren. No sign of Rachel. No sign of his parents. And he preferred it that way. Then, one afternoon, as he was closing up at the garage, a familiar face appeared in the doorway. "George. You got a minute, kid?" Nathan wiped the grease from his hands and leaned against the counter. "Always." George took a seat, looking around the garage with a small nod of approval. "You really did it," he mused. "Better than I ever could have." Nathan smiled. "You gave me the shot. That's all I needed." George scoffed. "I gave plenty of guys shots. You're the only one who didn't waste it." There was a pause, the kind that only happened between two men who had mutual respect but didn't feel the need to say it outright. George finally broke the silence. "So, what's next for you?" Nathan exhaled, staring out at the lot filled with cars. "Honestly," he looked back at George, "I don't know." And for once, that didn't scare him. For so long, his life had been about survival, about proving people wrong, about reclaiming his dignity. Now, he was just living, and that was enough. As George stood to leave, he clapped a hand on Nathan's shoulder. "Whatever it is, you'll figure it out." Nathan smiled, watching as his old mentor walked out the door. He locked up the garage, drove home, and sat on his porch as the sun dipped below the horizon. There was no more anger, no more resentment, no more ghosts from his past trying to drag him back down. He had built a life without them. And in the end, that was the best revenge of all.